All of my greatest adventures begin with a dream, and no dream had I held longer than my desire to hike the John Muir Trail. As Julia and I drove north on the 395 towards our starting point in Yosemite, it was an eerie feeling to look up at the summit of Mount Whitney from Lone Pine, some 10,000 feet above us. It would take us 210 miles with 80,000 feet of elevation change while passing through Yosemite, Kings Canyon, and Sequoia National Parks. I was reminded of the words of Meriwether Lewis before his famous expedition with William Clark. I could but esteem this moment of my departure as among the most happy of my life. We began our first day early at 5 a.m., charged and ready despite the darkness. Before we had even made it 1 mile, a soul-shaking blast of thunder put shivers down my spine. Thunderstorms are anathema on a planned through hike, but a part of the process you just have to accept. This wasn't how I envisioned our adventure starting off, but the outdoors will teach you patience and perseverance. The rain began to clear as we approached the Merced Lake Junction towards Sunrise Lakes. The landscape was beginning to shift into a softer palette of greens and reds, just as the horizon began to draw us in with the kind of views you'll only find in Yosemite. It was just the burst of inspiration we needed to climb up and over Sunrise Mountain to reach our lunch spot of High Sierra Camp. After leaving High Sierra Camp behind, the John Muir Trail cuts through Long Meadow with stunning views of Cathedral Peak and Columbia Finger. Long Meadow was followed by a final climb up and over the 9,700-foot Cathedral Pass, and a long descent into Tuolumne Meadows, where the rain caught back up with us. Julia and I had fast-packed our first day and picked up the bulk of our food and supplies that we had mailed ahead to the Tuolumne Meadows post office. We then waddled over to the Tuolumne Backpackers Camp and quickly pitched our tent to stay dry before the next wave of precipitation rolled in. Anyone who spent a night sleeping outside can tell you how magical backpacking can be. There's something about the warmth of a sleeping bag in the cold black of night, the smell of wood smoke, and food shared around a fire after a hard day on the trail. It harkens back to another time and puts us all in touch with where we've come from and who we used to be. Second day of hiking, Julia and I hit the trail just after daybreak with nothing but clear blue skies overhead. The lush green landscape of Lyle Canyon pulled us forward, and the warm sun began the process of thawing us out from a night of damp near freezing temperatures. It was the perfect way to gain momentum on our way to the 11,050-foot Donahue Pass. A series of switchbacks took us up and out of Lyle Canyon and into a stretch of trail that delivered my first of many transcendent JMT moments. Glacial lakes, bubbling creeks, and towering snow-capped peaks were in every direction. There were wildflowers in bloom, trout splashing, and birds singing, all under a pitch blue sky with puffy white clouds. I was overcome with a humble sense of appreciation, and in the moment, felt incredibly fortunate just to exist. A short spate of thunder and hail chased us from Donahue Pass faster than we had hoped for, but as the skies turned gray, our spirits stayed bright. The view of Banner Peak up ahead was a lighthouse in the wilderness, pulling us forward in a sea of green slopes, mountain towers, babbling brooks, and trampled earth. We made it to our campsite of Thousand Island Lake and found a flat outcrop situated just out of the direct path of the howling wind. As I looked out onto the shimmering waters, I couldn't help but think, of all the places I've laid my head to rest, I'd be hard-pressed to name one more beautiful than this. Upon leaving Thousand Island Lake, the John Muir Trail took us past Emerald and Ruby Lakes before descending a series of switchbacks to Garnet Lake, where we were treated to early morning views of the ethereal Mount Ritter. The mild bobbing of the water was hypnotic, as the clouds painted the sky in veiled sheets of white. Everything in me wanted to call it a day and set up camp right there at 9 a.m., but there were more miles ahead. We passed by Devil's Postpile National Monument just before arriving at Red's Meadow, where we made our second resupply of the trip. We also took time to enjoy some delicious burgers and lemonade from the Red's Meadow restaurant. From there, we put in a few more miles and made camp, just off trail near Deer Creek. The silence and solitude of a mountain sunrise brings a lot of clarity to the mind. 93 million miles away, we watch the sun rise to signify another day. The moment is forthcoming when I've likely seen more sunrises than I'll see in the future. To feel like you're making the most of each day and living your life to the fullest is truly a moment of pure happiness. From Deer Creek, we hiked uphill to Purple Lake and continued on before being stopped dead in our tracks by the shimmering waters of Lake Virginia. It was the perfect spot to stop for a long early morning break. The downhill hike from Lake Virginia to Tully Hole was pretty steep, but offered up a series of spectacular views. It wasn't long before we were hiking back uphill towards the 10,900-foot Silver Pass. We decided to camp high for the night and found a spot just over Silver Pass at Silver Pass Lake. Not all sections of the John Muir Trail feel like a stroll through Heaven's Gate. The climb up a dusty track of switchbacks towards Bear Ridge comes to mind. All I kept thinking about were the alpine lakes we had seen in the miles before. In life and on trail, you have to be careful what you wish for, because shortly after growing tired of the dusty Bear Ridge, a creek did emerge, and we were swarmed with mosquitoes during our afternoon stroll through Rosemary Meadow. The buzzing bites were abated by a healthy application of DEET, and I went back to admiring the cloudy skies, conifer forest, and angular peaks that had us striding forward into a postcard, and onto our campsite for the night, the 10,555-foot Marie Lake. This was the point on the trail that signified we had walked 100 miles. It was all going by so quickly. Every great story seems to feel this way, where the climax and ending come far too soon. And it's only looking back on it that you can truly appreciate how special the journey was. We hiked up and over Selden Pass before making a descent into Muir Trail Ranch to grab the biggest resupply of our trip. Our packs were heavy on weary legs, so we decided to set a snail's pace as we ambled along the South Fork of the San Joaquin River. Not much further down the trail, we were introduced to the undulating power of Evolution Creek and the Cascades dancing downhill. It wasn't long before we reached the crossing of Evolution Creek, where we only had to wade knee-deep through the water due to it being a severe drought year. Our campsite for the night was Colby Meadow, with sunset views and ambling deer nearby. We reached a series of switchbacks, and just after the sun began to dominate the horizon, we were standing at 10,850 feet on the banks of Evolution Lake. We were now into the back half of the John Muir Trail, and it was pretty amazing to watch the landscape transition to a canvas of gray peaks, talus fields, and blue alpine lakes as we continued to gain elevation. Over the next 5.5 miles, we would hike up to the 11,955-foot Muir Pass with the iconic Muir Hut. Along the way, we were stopped dead in our tracks by the stunning blue waters of Wanda Lake, filled with an abundance of tadpoles swimming under the reflective waters. The downhill stretch from Muir Pass was as equally spellbinding as the uphill, with incredible views looking down into Big Peat Meadow. Although it was still early in the afternoon, the sun was blocked by the walls in the west, making for a very pleasant end to the day. We found a secluded spot in Grouse Meadow and made camp for the night, with no company but the deer. The most interesting thing about camping in a deep valley is that the sun sets early and rises late. With towering mountains on either side of our campsite, it was a surreal feeling to be held in such a lingering and sustained stretch of dusk and dawn. From Grouse Meadow, we readied our legs for an 11-mile, 4,100-foot climb up what is known as the Golden Staircase to the 12,080-foot Mather Pass. This hike was steep and relentless, but offered a nice place to break at Lower Palisade Lake, just before the landscape goes completely barren, lifeless, and gray, amidst gradations of talus, scree, and granite towers. My lungs were really starting to feel the lack of oxygen, and my feet were feeling the acute force of every jagged stone underfoot. We made our way down the switchbacks from Mather Pass and took time to enjoy the views of the tarns below. The upper basin was truly spectacular. We followed the setting sun and golden hours of daylight past the South Fork King's Crossing to our campsite near the shores of Marjorie Lake. The mind and body quickly forget what things were like at home. Sleeping in a tent and eating dehydrated meals feels as familiar as your own reflection. Life on the trail is true happiness. Waking up and walking is one of my favorite expressions of freedom. My mind and body fully in tune. My legs and feet conditioned and hard, ready for whatever the day has in store. While my mind can explore its own expanse, just as my body explores the terrestrial expanse of the wilderness. From Marjorie Lake, we hiked up to the 12,130-foot Pinchot Pass, where we were greeted with gusting winds and mischievous-looking skies up ahead. As we approached the alluring landscape of the Ray Lakes Basin, we could see the skies growing dark over the 11,926-foot Glen Pass. Ray Lakes is one of the most popular backpacking destinations in the Sierra, and it's pretty easy to see why. Julia and I had decided to take a long break and enjoy the Ray Lakes Basin, despite the darkening skies. We met a couple near the Ray Lakes Ranger Station that said although the skies were dark, the conditions on the pass were actually quite favorable. We decided to push on and give it a go. The climb towards Glen Pass is a series of switchbacks, taking you away from the blue and green beauty of Ray Lakes Basin and into an alpine lake-dotted granite wonderland that is pretty breathtaking in its own right. Although we began to experience a little precipitation, some thunder, and a scary spate of dark clouds, it was hard not to be optimistic. We had made it this far and only had a small climb left. As we entered into the final 35 miles of the John Muir Trail before reaching the summit of Mount Whitney, my mind was awash with the mix of emotions that seems to swell up at the end of every great adventure. It was the excitement of accomplishing a long-held dream, alongside the sadness of knowing this incredible moment in time would soon be coming to an end. We only had the 13,200-foot Forester Pass left to climb until we would reach the shores of Guitar Lake for our final night on the JMT. It was the song of a body in harmony, one foot in front of the other, my footsteps the metronome of my life, my breathing in perfect harmony, my lungs in tune with the air. But we still had an additional 16 miles until we'd reach Guitar Lake. Those 16 miles came smooth and easy, as we passed through the Martian landscape of the Bighorn Plateau while being teased with passing glances of Mount Whitney to the east. The final climb to Guitar Lake was pretty tiring on weary legs, but with places like Timberline Lake to take breaks, it wasn't so bad. We made it to Guitar Lake a few hours before sunset and took in the festive atmosphere. In a land of open space and secluded campsites, Guitar Lake was a festival-type campground in comparison, with at least 30 tents scattered about the shores. We woke up and walked the final miles of the John Muir Trail in the early morning darkness before reaching the junction at Trail Crest. Just as we arrived at the Keeler Needle, the sun broke above the horizon. From there, it was only a few more steps until we were standing on the highest point in the contiguous United States. This was it. After 210 miles of hiking on a journey that began in Yosemite, we had reached our destination, the summit of Mount Whitney. My mind was once again awash with an overflow of thoughts and emotions. The mountains draw us in and show us a glimpse of who we are, who we once were, and who we want to be. Our minds are like the sunset, the passing of the clouds, and the ephemeral nature of all that is fleeting. You have to pay attention, be vigilant. Most of all, you have to be present. Looking back, it isn't the memory of that summit that sticks with me the most. It's the daily process, the day in and day out. Each step, each rising sun, each photon of light, and each unbroken thought. The storms roll in and the storms roll out. We're just here to observe it. The time is always now, and this world stops for none of us. I'll take that with me wherever I go, and know that even when perspective seems lost, I can always come back to find it on the trail.